Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, riders, striders and fugitive hiders, welcome along to the Joe Spivey YouTube channel where we discuss books and little else. And you join me on the dreariest of Wednesday mornings. It is the 1st of October, so white rabbits to you all. And today we are getting rather heady. Things are going to be very cerebral, very complex, very discussional. We're going to engage in proper tertiary educational dialogue. Okay, usually usually a C-list celebrity slides down a downhill into some gunge, or there is usually some perhaps quasi-geopolitical comment made by me. Usually we get rather fun and rather Woodhouseian, and things are a little light-hearted at the start of the video, but we're not really going to bother with that today. So if you want comedy and if you want inane babble, then you must go either to Mark at A Book Time with Elvis or BookTube's cartoon hedgehog Christopher Russell. Quite why Mark from A Book Time with Elvis came to me, I do not know. He is a perfectly respectable channel, and yet here he is catching strays. So we must think first of all of the cornerstones of this YouTube channel. I like to think of it as a collective. I like to think on here that the workers own the means of production. Of course, you have your slim and glossy CEO, but I share rather more of the profits than other YouTube channels with you. So this is our channel, and what have been, would you say, the biggest cornerstones of this channel? We have had, first of all, what do we mention most? What has sustained our notice and our focus? We have the kleptocratic fascism of Donald Trump in the United States. We have all sports, be it rugby league and football. We have canonical literature, Trollope, Woodhouse, Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, George Eliot, the rest of them. And we have what you might call the emaciation of the mind. In other words, short-form content and how that has bled into the book sphere, and how nobody reads, and how short-form content is zombifying us and making gloop of our minds, and how that should be fought against, or at least deeply regretted. And it is the fourth leg on which this house stands that we'll be thinking about today, because I have recently read an article or Substack piece by James Marriott, whom I hear to be a book critic in his own right. I myself am as well, a book critic, and so I take the work of others when I come upon it I take it rather seriously, and so I'll probably be buying a copy of the Times at some point this week, so as to hear what he has to say, or to read what he has to say. I don't buy newspapers because they are far too expensive, and or at least for what they are definitely far too expensive. They should really charge £1 a month to read everything online. They would still make trillions, because they would then have 5 million national subscribers, but that would mean that Lord Rothermere at the Daily Mail would have to sell his 8th country estate rather than his 17th or whatever. But we'll park the financial politics of newspapers and the 4th estate for a moment. But yeah, James Marriott is a book critic for the Times, and he has written a Substack piece, I think, entitled Welcome to the Post-Literate Society, or Notes from a Post-Literate Society, something like that. And it looks at bibliophobia, the decline of reading, booklessness amongst the masses, and the moral, political, and I think cognitive implications of that. Now, we must remember, we are in a marginalised cornucopia here. We have myself and 27 others, each of whom read 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe even 25 books per month. We are bibliophiles, and we forget that whether it's the President of the United States, or the postman, or the lorry driver, or indeed the tax clerk, or the Olympic swimmer, none of them read at all. And if they tell you that they do read, they are probably lying to your face, okay? It is the strangest and indeed most revolutionary activity that can be undergone in a world of fast-paced flashiness, to sit in a room and listen to, or indeed read the dulcet vocabulary of anyone on the page is indeed, I think, as I say, a revolutionary act, something not done by many. And so we need to remember that 0.4% of the population reads, and 80% of that 0.4% only read one book a year around the pool in Portofino. Those of us who read, I would say properly, those of us who actively apportion 2 to 3 hours per day, heaven forfend, to reading, is infinitesimal. It is laughably and diabolically, it is a diabolically slim section or portion of the population, and so we need to remember that. And Marriott addresses it, but yeah, as I say, that I think I've outlined roughly what he aims at, but we're going to go. I wrote notes, which is a rarity for me. But as I was reading it last night, I made notes, and I want to comment on them and use them as springboards from which to jump onto matters bigger and beefier. So the first bullet point that I've written down, or what is on my first bullet point, is Marriott links the Enlightenment, capital E, to the printed word and the inference-led rationality that such a format demands. In other words, whenever the printing press comes into being, I think Marriott dates it, obviously the word Gutenberg comes to mind, but I never know where to place him, whether that's in the 12th century or the 17th, but I think it's around about 1600 when things are first tabulated. Of course, you have cave paintings and all sorts of parchment, but when you have a proper printing press where the codex can be distributed to thousands of people, where you go from reading 1 or 2 books a year written out to 13 books a week if you so choose, and he links the sort of the concretization and solidification of that. So you have a clause, then you have a comma, then you have a clause, and you have a comma, then you have a clause, and you have to both admit some of that information to your short-term memory. You have to judge what is being said in comparison to what you think about something else, and you have to concentrate a great deal, and it leads, again, apparently to a rationality and to a polity, or indeed just an individual who thinks an awful lot about more about what is being presented. It seems abstract and it seems a bit strange, but that's what he gets at. Again, it's like many of the judgments in the article. I think it is, as Jonathan Miller might have said, rationalistic without it being valid. In other words, you can see the turns his mind is taking, and yet after 10 minutes you as my eyes are doing now, you find your eyes narrowing, and you become slightly skeptical. It sounds as if it makes sense, and yet you don't know whether there is any veridicality to it. For those of you playing Joe Spivey Verbal Bingo, veridicality is worth 4 points this morning. I will leave a link to the article down below, just so that you can better grasp it yourself, and it might well be better for you to read the article and then listen to my warblings. But the next bullet point reads, and this was my main takeaway, was that it portrays phones as purely awful vendors of, and I quote, pointless notifications, inane short-form videos, and social media rage bait. Now, it must be said that perhaps the internet is comprised of perhaps 75 to 80% of such pointless notifications and inane short-form videos. But rather like a baby's bottle, the technologies and mediums, I think, are pretty morally neutral. They can be used for good and for ill, so that you could nurture a small child with a baby's bottle, or you could bludgeon it to death. In other words, it's in the hands of the owner, and so I didn't like the spicily cynical and rushed way in which Marriott said that phones were essentially all awful, and you should never look at one at all, even if your mother's calling you and she's bleeding out in the street. If you want to look up a particular event in Robert Oppenheimer's life, you shouldn't do that on a phone. You should go to the British Library and you should seek out the original documentation. He characterises phones as purely and invariably awful. Now, they are pretty awful, and they do lead to an awful lot of individualization and relentless personalization, and they have led to the balkanization of societies, I don't doubt. But there are good points to them as well, okay? You can take a lovely picture of, God knows, the Grand Canyon or the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and you can remember it forever, whereas in 1774, you had to rely on, you know, whoever, Mark Twain, or you had to rely on travel writers, not Mark Twain, he was not even born then, was he, Joe? But you had to rely on your own memory, or you had to rely on somebody else. There are good points to these technologies. I mean, heaven, the irony is elephantine. Were it not for the phone and bi-directional digital media, James Marriott wouldn't have been able to have uploaded his Substack and probably would never have been heard of, because you had to be in the top 4% of society even to have any of your work reviewed. And Joseph Edward, in his centre-parted glory, would not be speaking to you now were it not for the phone, the camera, the microphone, and all of the coltan which is mined in the Democratic Republic of the Congo in the phone. Okay, so it's all right us berating technology when the act that I'm performing at the moment in October 2025 would not be possible were it not for these technologies. So, and I think it's become rather catty and rather techy and rather what should we say, thoughtlessly casual to just want all phones to be burned on a bonfire by patrician intellectuals and by progeny of the bourgeoisie, in other words. And so I don't like the way that people just instantly and quickly malign all phones as if they are cigarettes or asbestos. Next up we have, this was a very, very valid argument indeed, and the one which I agreed with the most. The canonical heirlooms of Austen and Dickens are gone because comprehension is impossible. Now, this is absolutely the case. Anybody born today will never read Samuel Johnson or Mary Wollstonecraft or Alexander Pope or Ludwig Wittgenstein or whomever. Pick your circumlocucious contrarian, whoever it may be. They will never be read nowadays, unless, as my children will be, they have Henry V under their noses by the age of 7. Comprehension has gone entirely. These surveys and studies are manifold, in either in the press or in academic studies, that naturally intelligent not sophomores, that's not the correct phrase, is it? Undergraduates in this country, naturally intelligent first years at university, are piling in to seminar rooms, and they're filling the pews of lecture halls, and yet they understand very, very little of, I think Marriott uses the opening of Bleak House as an example, but they couldn't read the first stanza of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. They couldn't read Common Sense by Thomas Paine. They would have absolutely no idea. It would be pretty much like me opening Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire translated into Lithuanian or whatever. It would be impossible on a syllable to syllable level, because they have spent the formative years of their life watching Brad Pitt and Dermot O'Leary. Points again for any of you who knows who Dermot O'Leary is. But you get what I mean. There is, because they're not reading Charlotte's Web or Little Women or Anne of Green Gables, because they are not, because young people, and perhaps indeed people in their 30s and 40s nowadays, because they do not have a grounding, because reading has not been set apart as a decent activity, they will not be able to learn. I spoke of this not long ago when I talked about reading retention. The amount of people I encounter who are put off from reading because they cannot hold in their heads a full page of text, not realising, of course, that if they read a little more, things will become more efficient and more easy, rather like if you exercise a little bit more, things become a little more efficient and more easy. And so, yeah, I do despair at that, and I do feel sorry for those individuals, because whether we read Trollope's Duke's Children, or Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, or The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, or whatever it is that are made, or whether we read, Coleridge or Wordsworth, anything that we find beautiful, we naturally are going to feel sorry for those who cannot, as a result of whatever, who cannot join us in that joyful activity. And so, yes, I do despair that the quality of individuals coming in and out of universities these days, as I've seen in seminar rooms myself, is not nearly what we might like. And then next up we have the major thrust of the article, I think, or at least the one with the most what should we say? The most important and influential implications. The takeaway, which is most connotative. For those of you playing Joe Spivey Verbal Bingo, connotative is worth 7 points this morning. He says that essentially irrationality and conspiratorial thinking are linked to the hegemony of the screen, because spoken arguments are more plausible than written ones. And this is, again, partly right and partly wrong, in that our way-faced Bostonian Steve Donoghue has ordered us many times to, instead of listening to the pathetic, infantile, mendacious warblings of the President of the United States, Donald Trump, instead of listening to them on YouTube, he instead tells us to print them out, because to read what he says is to confirm his madness. And that is indeed true, such that Donald Trump, Alex Jones, Stephen Crowder, David Icke, I think Russell Brand is mentioned in James Marriott's piece, all of these witless conspiratorial grifters would not be able to accurately convey and so persuasively convey their stupid and senseless and groundless and baseless ideas on the page. They would not be able to do it properly in The Spectator or in The Guardian or in any pamphlet popularly distributed. Okay, it is all the spoken word. Everything that if everything that I'd said in this video had been converted into print and prose, you'd probably think me crazy as well. In other words, if you hear a mad idea, it is more likely that you will believe it or find credence in it if it is spoken to you, and that leads to what, a decline in anti-democracy. That's a rather big jump, but it can lead to anarchy and to heartlessness and to the post-literate, post-truth era, which we perhaps look to avenge in the next decades or so. I do not know, but obviously there are caveats and pitfalls to that argument. The first and most obvious being that if you're going to lay the presidency of Donald Trump at the feet of short-form content, you must first of all square the circle of most of Kamala Harris's voters, 50% or 49.8% of the voting American population, also not reading. So if you are going to say that mindlessness and booklessness and all of the screen-based short-form content drives people to Donald Trump, you can only admit that it is 50% successful, because people who have not read anything since they anything but a greeting card since they were 17, most of whom happen to vote for Kamala Harris. If you see what I mean, it's not the preserve of bookless people to vote for Donald Trump, nor is it all people who view short-form content who are red-hatted fascists in the 21st century. So that was another one of my negative aspects. I don't believe, in other words, that the reading is morally, what's the word I want to use? I don't believe that reading is morally absolute or morally advisable or something to shame people on. I don't think just because you've read Lionel Trilling or whomever else, William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon, I don't believe just because you've read those that you are better morally, because Niall Ferguson and Piers Morgan and Adolf Eichmann have all read loads and loads and loads, and yet they've made moral mistakes of their own and have plumbed moral depths. So those are essentially my thoughts on the matter. I thought the piece in general was a tad repetitive in its grandiosity, but there were some nice quotes that we may as well read out. The most alarming of which was, "We may be about to find out that it is not possible to run the most advanced civilization in the history of the planet with the intellectual apparatus of a pre-literate society." So there we go. I've found myself running out of steam after 20 minutes, but that's okay. Marriott mentions the 3-hour debates between Abraham Lincoln and Grover Cleveland, maybe, or two very, very prominent presidents, and citing how erudition, extemporaneous, spontaneous, unprepared erudition is now the preserve, or is now the preserve of the 19th century, rather than 2025. But yeah, I thought, I thought its head was on fire, in other words, in the article. There are points which are to be taken seriously, but some instances in which I think Marriott sort of gets carried away on his own hobby horse. Because he's a writer and a reader and a book critic, he naturally supposes that reading and writing is the single foundation. He does caveat things, and there's an asterisk or asterized section where he admits that many developments and many Roman falls are multifactorial and cannot just be put down to the codex and reading. So there we go. That's what I wanted to say. This has been another clickbaity video. But, you know, I've seen that these videos do extremely well, strangely, whenever you become apocalyptic or whenever you shout sic transit gloria mundi, whenever you forecast the falling of the sky in a readerly way, that you know, apparently people swarm in and they want to know. So I want to know, having read James Marriott's piece, what you think of it and what you thought of my responses, and whether you think because AI is taking over, because nobody reads Penguin Classics anymore, we are going to descend politically, demographically, and morally. That's what I want to know. But I am just about done with my babblings today, and I shall promise to be more comical and more farcical in my next video. But yes, I will, as per usual, folks. Thank you ever so much for watching, and probably just bid you the fondest of earthly farewells.